Mr Speaker.
I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Kia ora koutou. A few days ago, the Prime Minister in his opening statement proposed that this year will be a busy and interesting one for local government. The local government scene is already most certainly busy and interesting in the Greater Auckland area, where the resistance is well underway to Local Government Minister Mr Hyde's demolition job on local democracy and his attempt to wrest away control of some $28 billion worth of assets out of the hands of the public who paid for them and into entities that will be ripe for selling to private interests from July 2012. We in Auckland are becoming very busy and interested in resisting this Rogernomics round 2 which is being imposed upon us. The battle to protect local democracy and representation is being fought out currently in Auckland, but we may be sure that if this government succeeds in imposing this model on Auckland, that other constituencies, other regions will very soon be made subject to the same regime. Mr Key indicated that the reforms of Auckland governance commenced by the former Labour-led government and picked up by this administration will continue with the new Auckland Council in place from November 1 of this year. Clearly, the Auckland region is significantly, in fact uniquely important to the nation's economy, and any steps to improve its economic, its environmental and indeed social performance are to be applauded. Sadly, however, the process that is in train to reform Auckland's governance and the all too predictable outcomes of that process are likely to be very destructive of the Auckland region's economy and to do real harm to its environmental and social and cultural well-being. The PM correctly notes in his statement that Aucklanders will elect representatives for the new council and local boards this October. But the reality is that Aucklanders have already been largely disenfranchised at the local level, to the extent that most of the power has been taken out of the hands of the people we elected in 2007 to represent us and put in the hands of the Auckland Transition Authority, a group containing no elected person, but rather people appointed by Mr Hyde in his role as local government minister. There is a real transfer of power happening under the guise of Auckland governance reform. This genuinely does constitute a step change, notably the removal of direct control of public assets away from our elected councillors and into the dubious care of unelected directors of so-called council-controlled organisations. And these worthies are to be appointed by the Minister of Local Government if he manages to push through his latest reform bill. We have already heard these council-controlled organisations referred to as council-controlling organisations, as cash cow organisations. Polling tells us that a majority of Aucklanders do not want the super city model that is being imposed on them. And over the last 2 weeks, I've spoken to and listened to hundreds of people in the communities all around the Auckland region, alongside a number of parliamentary colleagues from the Labour Party. Of the hundreds of people who have turned out to local halls in the communities all around Auckland, I can report that 2 individuals expressed some hope that the new model, they believe, will deliver long overdue infrastructure development, particularly to the rural areas. I did not have to attempt to disabuse these people, these 2 people, of their belief, as their own neighbours quickly dispelled their false hopes. It may be, and perhaps ought to be, of concern to some national members, especially those in marginal Auckland seats, that the opposition to Mr Hyde's plan is both wide and deep. Even in the heart of Mr Key's own Helensville electorate a few nights ago, a very crowded hall of irate ratepayers expressed their distaste for being brought under this regime, which is not of their making and of which they want to have no part. The Prime Minister suggests that, and I quote, "the reforms will simplify and streamline governance structures within the Auckland region. This will result," he says, "in better, more cost-effective public services for Aucklanders delivered through integrated planning and service delivery across the region." This is presumably some sort of code for what is really happening, which is to remove most of the functions and virtually all of the assets, the significant assets currently managed by local authorities, some $28 billion worth of assets, which will be passed over to a number of these council-controlled organisations. These organisations will be effectively beyond the control of the councillors who we will elect. Mr Hyde has reserved to himself the right to appoint the boards of directors who will run these organisations, of which only one, the transport organisation, may have up to 2 elected members on a board of perhaps 6 or 8. And no other of the 6 or 8 council-controlled organisations may have any elected people on their board. We can readily anticipate that the veil of commercial secrecy will very quickly be drawn down, which will deny Aucklanders the right to know how and in whose interests their public assets are being managed. And this fact alone makes a mockery of Mr Key's claim in his speech that the government is committed to changes that will give all ratepayers better information about their local council and ultimately more influence over their council's activities and spending. In fact, residents and ratepayers will have very little information about what is happening to their hard-earned assets, and they'll have even less influence over the council's activities and spending than they currently do. The bill puts a moratorium on the sale of strategic assets, but only until July 2012, which means the council elected in a few months' time would have ample opportunity to propose and implement privatisation plans before the next election in 2013. Returning to the claim that we will enjoy more integrated and better services, how can 7 or 8 or more corporate entities nominally publicly owned, but in reality one large step away from public control or overview, possibly deliver cost-effective public service or integrated planning and services the PM talked about? The one tool in the third Auckland Bill that ought and might provide a coherent long-term strategic plan based on an extensive consultation process with residents is very obviously flawed. The spatial plan is proposed to facilitate growth and development in the new enlarged city. There are no qualifiers on those words like sustainable growth or systems-based development, just growth and development. To me and to many others, to many other of the hundreds of concerned citizens we've spoken to and listened to in the last couple of weeks, this signals a return to the worst excesses of Rogernomics Round 1 that saw the massive tearing apart of the physical, the social, the environmental and the heritage fabric of Auckland and indeed much of the country during the 1980s and the 1990s. Mr Key's stated goal of lifting our country's economic performance, delivering jobs, increasing incomes and better living standards will not be achieved by a return to these failed policies and Wild West development practices. Aucklanders will be denied the right to propose any reorganisation until at least 2013, a right the residents of every other constituency have. Aucklanders will be obliged to stay with the first-past-the-post election process, unlike every other constituency in New Zealand who may propose a change to their electoral system. One thing this bill has achieved, it has raised interest in local government. It has certainly stimulated people's interest in their local government, but perhaps not in the way that the government intended or will hope for. Thank you, Mr Speaker.